Okay, let's start off. Welcome back. What were we doing? What did we do? We described the manage experts use case. Yes, specifically add expert. Now, let's shift our focus from the use case view to the logical view and package only. And let's push it down. And under this, one of the most important activity is to create what is called as domain model. Now here, what is our domain? Our domain is online candidate testing in a particular organization. So keeping that in mind, we have to identify the various domain elements and understand their relationships to each other. Okay, so this we are going to document in a class diagram, and the name of the diagram, let it be the same as the package name. Now what are the various, and here remember, when we are doing this particular activity, we have to look at everything that we have with respect to the project, all the requirements documents. What are those things about which our system has to be aware of? Okay, let's go through this use case view. Our system has to maintain information about the candidates, has to manage the information about the candidate. So we don't drag and drop that. We create a class to represent this human candidate. Yes. So candidate. Now if I give the name of the class as candidate, you should be in a position to understand the difference between this candidate and this candidate. This is the actor candidate who is outside the system. This is inside the system representing this candidate. Okay. Now what else? Our system has to also manage information about the expert. So again, to represent that expert actor, we'll create a class. Okay, another way of looking at it is we are trying to identify those entities from the domain which are critical to the functioning of this system. Okay, purely from a domain perspective, does it matter who the training executive is or the training manager is? It doesn't matter, because we are not maintaining any information with respect to the executive and the manager. Okay, then what else? We also have to, because this entire system is with respect to tests, we have to have a class to represent the test. Okay, the test is given for a particular subject and anything else. Candidate, expert, subject, test, and there is a batch, right? Because the candidates are undergoing the training in batches. So parallelly there might be multiple batches are running. Okay, what else? Yes, questions. Okay, so one thing is that you just identify whatever you can think of, and then one by one you again review them and see whether they are really required or not. For example, you might identify answers also as an entity, but then you will realize that answers are part of the question itself, right? So they could be treated as properties of the question itself. Okay, so now the next step is to figure out the relationship between these entities. We have association, generalization, composition, aggregation. So to begin with, let's just use association. A candidate is associated to a batch. A candidate gives a test. A test is for a subject. A subject has questions. During the test, questions are asked. An expert creates questions. An expert is also associated to a subject. Just keep moving it around and try to figure out whether the crisscrossing can be avoided. Many times it would be possible to avoid. Okay, now actually, the expert actually plays two different roles with respect to the question in this relationship. So basically it has two different relationships with respect to the question. One is as a creator, right? The other is as a reviewer. So here expert plays a role of creator and expert plays the role of reviewer. Plays two different roles. So for every different role that is played by a class with respect to another class, that many associations we have to establish. Now we have to identify multiplicities. So what's a multiplicity? Basically, looking at a class diagram, we have to look at two classes at a time. So let's look at candidate and batch. A candidate will be associated with how many batches? A candidate would be associated with one batch. Or here you have to understand the complete life cycle. In the sense, you have to figure out when the candidate object is created. As part of the creation itself, will it be associated to a batch? Or will all the candidates be added first? And then at a later point in time, they will be assigned to various batches. That seems more likely. So in that case, the multiplicity will be 0.1. Okay. And these batches are related to specializations, remember. So can a candidate move from one batch to another, basically changing his specialization? Yes, possible. So in which case, do we need to maintain that information that he was there in this batch and then he shifted to this batch? That would be tricky, right? But possible. So let's say 0.star. And a batch will be associated with how many candidates? A batch would be associated with 0.star. So when will it be 0? It might happen that all the batches are created separately and later on candidates are assigned. So initially it will be 0 and then it will fill up. Okay, a candidate would be associated with how many tests? To begin with 0, and as the course progresses, n number of tests will be conducted. A test will be associated with how many candidates? A test would be specific for a candidate. So if a test exists, then it will represent the test for a particular candidate. A test will be associated with how many subjects? A test will be for a particular subject. Yes. A subject will be associated with how many tests? 0 or 1. A test will be associated with how many questions? To begin with 0, and then things will build up. A question will be associated with how many tests? Initially it may be 0, and as over a period of time it will appear in n number of tests. Okay. Now a question will be for how many subjects? And let's keep it simple and say each question will be specific for a subject. A subject will be associated with how many questions? To begin with 0, and as time goes by, star. A subject will be associated with how many experts? A subject to begin with will be 0, and over a period of time there might be n number of experts. An expert would be associated with how many questions as creator, or rather, in other words, an expert will create how many questions? To begin with 0, and as time goes by, star. An expert will review how many questions? Again, 0 or more. A question will be created by how many experts? 1. A question will be reviewed by how many experts? This is important. So if we are not sure about any of this, what we have been discussing, it has to be clarified with the customer. Let him decide what the multiplicity would be indirectly. You can't really go to your customer and say a reviewer will be associated with how many questions, or rather a question will have how many reviewers associated. You have to convert it into a plain English question. So you might say, when would a question be treated as approved, or how many reviewers have to approve it for it to be a approved question? So in our case, let's keep it simple and say at least one reviewer has to approve it. So initially it would not have been reviewed, but then if one of them reviews it, okay, so 0.1. An expert will be associated with how many subjects? Now, an expert could be for multiple subjects. So can an expert be associated with 0 subjects? No. An expert has to be at least 1. So this is called a domain model because it contains only domain elements or domain entities. What I'll also do is put a note and say that this is a domain model, right? And this is treated as the foundation, an important foundation for any project. Contains key elements, or also called as key abstractions from the domain. Relationships between the abstractions needs to be kept updated. So that's the domain model of a given context. That's enough for today. Bye. See you in the next session.